On one occasion, I got together the leaders of ISIS and I said, I would like you to come and have dinner with me. And they said, we'll
Wow.
come and have dinner with you, but we'll chop your head off afterwards. People always say to me, whose side are you on? The Israelis or the Palestinians? And I say, no, I'm on everybody's side. I love the Jews as much as the Palestinians. I didn't just live with them, I loved them.
I'm really curious, what was the events leading up to being thrown in prison?
They were all dead, and the dungeon was full of chopped up pieces of body, and there were fingers and toes. And I said, Lord, I don't mind if they take my feet, but not my hands. I need to write. Praise God, he got me out of there.
My goodness. Sheesh. Welcome back to the Story Vault podcast, the #1 podcast for the real stories and exclusive insights behind your favorite experts, creators, and thinkers. Today is a very, very capital VERY special episode. I'm joined with a legend, a general, and a very close friend of mine. I'm honored to have Canon Andrew White on the podcast. Welcome.
It's wonderful to be with you, Aidan, because you just so happen to be the best person I've ever worked with.
Oh, that's a privilege. I always think back to the privilege I had of staying with you for a summer, living with you and working together with you. We had some great times. And I know you've written multiple books, but when I get to the around to writing one day, that the moments we had together will definitely feature there.
Good.
So Andrew, tell me, where are you at right now? You at your base?
At the moment, I'm in my home in Liverpool in South England. It is in between Guildford and Petersfield, on the way to Portsmouth, but not quite there. You can't see the sea from here, but drive an hour down the road and you can. So
Yes.
it's really it's still a suburb of London. Most people around here work in London, and so it's a kind of delights of the London commuter belt in Surrey, which generally speaking is where all the rich people live.
Legend has it, Andrew, that when I was staying with you, even though it's a beautiful place, you called it the Brussels sprout of
Brussels
England.
out, yes. Because I also call my road the most boring place in England.
All right, Andrew, I am so excited for this episode. I know you've done multiple podcasts in the past over your tenure. But today, as this is the Story Vault podcast, we go into the vault of people's lives, people's stories, hear how they've become the person they are and what they've achieved. So I know that you have a fascinating life from early days, medical school, as a doctor. You've been a priest in England, in Baghdad, they're known as the Vicar of Baghdad. And then you're back home. You've traveled around the world teaching
Jerusalem.
Jerusalem, teaching faith, teaching peace relations in colleges all over around the world. And I remember living with you, and I feel like every famous person I ever mentioned, I was like, "Oh, Andrew, have you met this person?" You're like, "Yeah, I've met that person. Yeah, I've met that person." So you have so many stories to tell. So first of all, Andrew, I want to hear. I don't think I've ever asked you this question. Tell me about a time where you facilitated some kind of peace negotiation between two rivals. Tell me a story about that. And what does that meeting even look like? Like, how do you even conduct that? What does that even look like?
Well, when your role has been as a conflict mediator, there are rather a lot of stories. I
Mm,
kind of came into this through the being director of the International Centre for Reconciliation at Coventry Cathedral. But
mm,
I was involved in reconciliation work before that. It really began when I was a student at Cambridge, when the students who were Jewish and the Christians fell out in a big way, and I was the one who tried to bring back the Christians and Jews together, and we created something called QJAC, the Cambridge University Jews and Christians. And then at the other end, I was involved in various major conflict situations, such as dealing with the 2002 major takeover at the church and nativity in Bethlehem, when we had
mm,
to negotiate the getting out of various hostages and release of people held by the terrorists. And then I
mm,
had major, really exciting things when there were conflicts between Christians and Muslims in Iraq,
mm,
and between Sunni and Shia. One of the most exciting things was actually working at trying to make peace in the middle of the war in Iraq. And I can remember the Prime Minister, Nouri al Maliki, saying to me one day, "Can you believe it, Andrew, that here we are in a major conflict between Shia Muslims and Sunni Muslims, and the only person who can help us is a Christian priest?" And so they're the
wow.
kind of extremes I've worked in.
Wow. Absolutely fascinating. I think it's just incredible, really, when I talk to you and listen to some of the work you've done, especially nowadays, our world, there's so much hostility, and being able to even get a couple of people together from two sides of the aisle, especially in the Middle East, is a miracle in and itself. But to actually come and meet, do you have like a favorite meeting or one you look back on, one of those peace negotiations that you're like, this was one of my favorite negotiations, or one of the most impactful negotiations that I got to mediate or be a part of?
I think my favorite negotiations are always the ones which are the most dangerous.
Hmm.
There's nothing like being involved in real danger when you're adrenaline junkie. And one of the reasons I ended up in this work was because my former life in medicine was running the cardiac arrest team at one of the biggest hospitals in London. So we basically dealt with crises all the time. And
Hmm.
I'll give you a choice. I can talk about the Jewish Christian conflicts, the Israeli Palestinian conflicts, the Sunni Shia conflicts, or various African conflicts between Muslims and Christians. You decide.
Hmm. That is a really good question. Well, you know what? For the sake of what's going on in our world at the moment, I'd really be interested to hear your experience with the Israel Palestine negotiations.
I was very privileged because I spent time in all communities in Israel and Palestine. And I didn't just live with them, I loved them. So
Hmm.
people always say to me, "Whose side are you on?" the Israelis or the Palestinians? And I say no, I'm on everybody's side. I love the
Mm.
Jews as much as the Palestinians. I love the other minority groups like the real Samaritans. And I think one of the really interesting things I did was when Yasser Arafat was the president of the PLO, the Palestinian Liberation Organization, and nobody could deal with him. Everybody was scared of him. And I went to work with him. And it's quite interesting because people say, how did you become such a good friend of the Palestinian leader? And I say it was really my 5-year-old boy. Because I asked my little boy, Jacob, who was 5 at the time, who would he like to come to his birthday party? And he used to see me on television all the time with these various leaders. And he said, I want you to bring me, yes, Sir Arafat. And I said, Jacob, it's not yes, Sir Arafat. It's Yasser Arafat. And so we argued for days about whether it was Yasser or yes, sir. But anyway, yes, Sir Arafat started to become a major part of Jacob's prayer life. Every night he would pray for Mummy, Daddy, and yes, Sir Arafat. And I can remember telling Yasser Arafat this, or as we called him, the Rais, which is Arabic for president. And I said, Rais, my little boy prays for you every night, and he calls you, yes, Sir Arafat. And I said, he loves you. And Yasser Arafat literally started crying when I told
Really?
him how much his little boy loved him. And
Wow.
then it got really strange then because it was his birthday, and Yasser Arafat said he wanted to talk to Jacob on his birthday. And
Wow.
so there I was, sitting in the bombed out Muqata in Palestine, speaking on the phone to my boy Jacob.
Wow.
And they became great friends with each other. We had a funny situation one day when Yasser Arafat phoned up and wanted to speak to Jacob. I said, Jacob, come quickly, President Arafat for you. He said, tell him I'm busy. I'm watching The Simpsons.
That's
So it
crazy.
was President Arafat or The Simpsons. And The Simpsons won. So that was a very interesting story. But in the
Wow.
Israeli Palestine conflict, I had to learn very quickly that the only way you really made peace was by being friends with the bad guys and teaching reconciliation. I always say to people, even now, you have to be friends with enemies, and you have to get enemies to listen to each other. How do you move forward? By listening.
Hmm. That's crazy. That's
That's
amazing. Honestly, it's just. Mind
easy,
blowing.
but it's very, very complex. How do you actually get people to listen to each other? When I was first working with the Sunni and Shia during the Lebanon crisis, I got all the Sunni leaders and the Shia leaders, the Lebanese leaders, and the Christian leaders to come together. And I said, what I want to do today is just to listen to each other's story. And I
Mm.
set aside 3 days for just listening. 3 days wasn't enough. 3 weeks
Wow.
wasn't enough. 3 months wasn't enough. And 3 years later, we were still doing it. And this is one of the
Wow.
key things in reconciliation. You have to be prepared to listen long time as the situation changes. And the other thing I realized very early on in this work is if you're dealing with the really, really bad guys, I refer to people as the bad guys or the good guys. You don't often deal with good guys, but with bad guys, you have to think, what am I going to get them? And I always
Wow.
used to say that when we meet, we eat. I would never invite really bad guys for any meeting without eating first. And I can
Mm.
remember that on one occasion, I got together the leaders of ISIS and I said, I would like you to come and have dinner with me. And they said, we'll
Wow.
come and have dinner with you, but we'll chop your head off afterwards. So I didn't
Oh
take
my
that meeting.
word. My goodness. Sheesh. That's crazy. That is absolutely crazy. I know that, Andrew, like you have, I mean, we've talked about it multiple times. You've met with, very influential people, very, let's just put it bluntly, leaders with really sad and evil plans. You've been involved in some high stakes negotiations with various groups, obviously even terrorist groups, and even in some ways you've actually come under fire for your some of your efforts to rescue people who've been taken hostages. What do you think is the most misunderstood aspects of these negotiations that the public might not really be aware of?
Well, I think the key thing is that people can't understand the concept of needing to be nice to people. When I was dealing with Yasser Arafat, I had to find out what he really wanted. What did he really like? And what he liked more than anything was glassy fruits. Now, glassy fruits you can't buy very easily. I used to buy them for him at Fortnum Mason's, the most expensive grocery shop in England. He would take them from Harrods as well, but he really liked them from Fortnum Mason's.
Crazy. So, what I'm hearing you say is that people who don't really understand what it's like to be in that situation don't understand what it means to be nice and give someone what they want, even if it's someone who might be causing pain or evil. But that that kind of negotiation is necessary for the big picture.
You've always got to be prepared to give something. And
Interesting.
when you give something, you've got to find out first, what do you really want? What would make your life different? And it's very difficult because we can talk about jelly sweets, but often what they want is something rather different, like
Mm.
guns or bullets.
How?
And I've been in situations where I've had to say, do I help these people to get weapons? And
Mm,
often we would get them weapons from even the American government.
dang.
So it's really, really big and really, really complicated. And these things
Mm,
I've done to try and achieve massive things, like trying to get back the sex slaves who had been
mm,
taken hostage from um, the Iraqis. But one thing you can't do, you can't fall into the trap of being used as their money broker. You can't
mm,
pay people for terrorism.
mm. Wow, that's crazy. Wow, that is so fascinating, and I think it's so interesting that this is so nuanced that it's very, very, I think, sad and ignorant to have any kind of opinion when you've never been involved in that type of work. So this is really interesting hearing from you, Andrew. I'd love to hear, you were at one point the Vicar of Baghdad. So I believe St. George's Church, the only church in Baghdad at the time, and I believe it at one point was the biggest church in the whole of the Middle East. You had clinics, you had schools, you had multiple things going on for
Operating
people there.
theatres, everything.
And it's incredible, and it's right in the middle of a war zone as well. So I'll let you take this wherever you want. Let's go for three of your favorite stories in your work in Baghdad. That can be the craziest miracle stories, just your own personal favorites. What are some of the most meaningful moments? Maybe three from that time working in Baghdad.
One of them was dealing with the most senior Ayatollah, the Grand Ayatollah. And the problem was that the American coalition, the Coalition Provisional Authority, was actually running Iraq at that time. And they formed together this coalition, which was made up of British and American diplomats, some other countries like Slovakia and Poland. But they had to also deal with the bad guys, and we were dealing with things like getting hostages out.
Hmm.
And I was the one who they used as their political, diplomatic, military diplomatic
Yeah.
negotiator.
Because you were the only one that they would listen to, right?
I was the only one who they would listen to because I went for dinner with them and they came for dinner with me. One of
Wow.
the things I used to say about negotiating in serious war zones is that most of it is to do with food. And when you like food, it's a rather good thing. It used to be a bit difficult because I went through quite a serious vegetarian stage at one point in my life. And when I went to see the Grand Ayatollah, he would always have a whole sheep on the table. They would cook me a whole lamb, not just the lamb's leg or shoulder of lamb, the whole thing, even the eyeballs and the brain.
Jeez. How was that to eat? Pass.
Interesting.
Interesting. Wow. That's amazing. That's a crazy
But
story.
in one of the key things in negotiating is the willing to compromise. If you don't have compromises, you can't move forward.
Hmm. How did you? I mean, was it through case by case thinking, talking, and prayer? How did you know what is the line when you're doing the compromise? How did you come to the conclusion of this is the line that we can't cross when it comes to compromise?
Well, I it was very much the basic rules of diplomacy, along with the big spiritual rules. There are certain things you can't compromise on from the point of view of your own faith.
Mm,
So, for example, I would never compromise on my own spiritual beliefs. And being very involved in Judaism, I would never compromise on the traditional Judaic beliefs. And I'd often have to try, particularly with Palestinian and Israeli negotiations, get each side to accept the stance of the other. And I think of the dealing with major Israeli Palestinian hostage negotiations. And one of my great leaders to this day was the man who at the time was foreign minister in Israel, working with Shimon Peres and Ariel Sharon. And we had to make huge compromises, but you could never give up on your fundamental beliefs of faith and practice.
that's
And I
amazing.
never did.
It's amazing. For us listening, do you have an example of what that might have looked like? What it would have looked like to have to compromise your faith? Would it mean, denouncing Jesus as God? Was it something else? Like an example?
Well, there are the fundamentals that I could never do. And often people would say to me, how can you say that you believe in the Trinity when we believe in one God?
Mm,
And one of the interesting things is in Arabic, when you say the blessing, you always say at the end, which means I believe in Father, Son, and Holy Spirit. But at the end of it, you always say one God.
mm,
I believe in the Trinity, who is one God. And that is a typical thing that I'm never willing to compromise on. Do I
mm,
understand the Trinity? No, often I don't understand the Trinity. I regularly go to different Christian congregations and say to them, do you understand the Trinity? Nobody really understands it, but we
mm,
believe it because it's mystery. In Judaism, you say the word kavanah. It's like your spirit. In your very spirit, in your essence, you know that God is one and God is three.
mm. Really interesting. Very, very interesting. Wow. That is awesome. I'm loving this. This is so interesting. I feel like we could go for like 7 hours talking about stories. I'd love to hear, Andrew. It's my favorite story. And I know you've shared it a few times, but it will always be my favorite. And I know I'll need to ask this on the podcast. It was the time where you were thrown in prison, and I'm not going to say much more because I know. the story is best when you tell it. But could you tell us that story in the entirety, from the meeting to the moment you were thrown, to what you saw in the prison when you used your torch to have a look, and then how you got out and what that looked like?
Do you mean when I was thrown in prison or when I was kidnapped?
Oh no,
I
sorry.
think
Yes, the kidnapping.
you mean when I was kidnapped. I've been
Correct.
thrown in prison.
Prison many times.
That's more civilized than being kidnapped
Yes. Yeah, you're
and
right.
thrown down a dungeon. And I have these wonderful pens with lights on, and there was no light in this dungeon at all. But after a few hours, I put the light on my pen, and I looked at the floor, and I realized that I had come to the right place. I had found the hostages, but they were all dead, and the
Oh,
dungeon was full of chopped up pieces of body, and there were fingers and toes, and I said, Lord, what I actually said, I don't mind if they take my feet off, but not my hands. I need to write.
mm,
Well, praise God, he got me out of there. And it was a miracle how I got out there. But I did.
sheesh. I mean, words can't really explain, try and describe that situation. I'm really curious. When you were kidnapped, what was the events leading up to being thrown in prison like? Was it? I can't remember now. Was it from sitting at a meeting? Was it people ransacked your home, ransacked where you were, and
No,
got you?
it
How did that
was
look like?
actually going to find some hostages. One of the things about working for hostage release is you have to know the kind of people who take hostages. And the people who take hostages are always really, really bad.
Hmm,
So the reason I could get hostages back was because I knew who the really bad guys were who took them. And we knew the kind of places where these people stayed. And after identifying the areas where they were, we actually went to that place. And on that occasion, they didn't want conversations, so they threw me down the dungeon as well. And it
jeez.
was incredible. It was the worst experience of my life. I often say I've never been scared in my work, and that was the only time I thought this could be it.
Wow.
And I really didn't like it. But in other times, I may have been shot at, blown up, but I've never been scared. I can cope with those things very well. But that was really the worst.
Wow. Oof. Insane. When you came out of that prison, um, sorry, the dungeon. Obviously, you were in the middle of nowhere. How did you get back to where you were supposed to get to?
Well, the only people who were around were the bad guys, and the
Yeah,
reason I
exactly.
got out was because I started negotiating with the bad guys how to get the really, really bad guys out of American detention in the war zone. And
Mm,
so I was talking to them and saying, I can work on this, I can get Khalid Ali back, I can get Hussein Mubarak back, but I need to be able to meet your people and meet the guys who make the decisions. And you are the guys who've lost, but the guys who've got are basically the American rulers of the whole situation. So I needed to get them to take me back to the American embassy.
Wow, that's crazy. I'm really interested now because I don't think I've ever asked you this question, but I'm definitely really interested to hear. When you
And
look back, when you look back, obviously, of course, the America-Iraq war, extremely politicized. Obviously, there's probably sides of the stories that us here in the UK or the US will never really have understood or seen or heard. Is there is there anything from the war during that time that you look back and realize, wow, and this can be anywhere you want to take it, but wow, this specific event or reality or mindset was completely, the people of the West were completely unaware of this.
I used to always say originally that I was in favor of the war to take Saddam out. But then, after the years of going through it all, I sat back and I realized what I said was wrong. What
Mm,
we did should never have happened, and how it happened should never have happened. And so it was learning the reality of the big state mistakes that we as the political and diplomatic leaders had made, and that was so difficult.
mm. What was it specifically that made you come to that conclusion that you saw? I'm sure there would
Well,
have been multiple
just
factors.
sitting back and realizing after all these years, I was in Iraq for 19 years in all because I was there well before the invasion happened.
Mm,
I was there trying to deal with things to stop the invasion. We failed big time. And after all of that, giving up so much of my life, I realized that I'd lost so much.
mm,
And they started accusing me of doing all sorts of things I shouldn't have done. And they even tried to lock me up at one stage. It was so drastic. But I know that I did not compromise on my faith or on the truths I stood for.
wow, it's profound, really. I remember there being a story. I think it would be such a great one to unpack, and then I have a follow-up question for you. But I believe it was one of the children amongst your community who was burned and then gave a speech at his assembly. Could you share that story for us? Because I just remember this story just it's so beautiful.
Well, there were several stories, but this was terrible. When one of our children was seriously chopped up and cut up and burnt to pieces. And his scarring all over his face and his neck, and he couldn't use his arm or anything. And it was only when he eventually got out of the Middle East and was taken to live as an exiled person in Canada, that he said, I lost absolutely everything. I lost the ability to see, I lost the ability to talk. But the one thing I never lost was the love of my Abuna Andrew. And I was called Abuna Andrew by them. And I was not just a father in the religious sense, I was like their physical and spiritual father, that I would be the one who provided everything for them: food, drink, water. But the most important thing they saw me as providing was their ability to talk with God and to worship God. And nothing could ever take that away from.
Wow.
Was
It's
that
just
what you were thinking of?
yeah, it was. It's profound. And I think, was there a scenario, a similar scenario? I'm not sure if it was the same scenario or a similar scenario where a year later in front of the school, the child, um, I can't remember, was it forgave the perpetrators? And was that in the same story? Or was that a different story?
No, it was the same boy, and he did a year later. He said, I now forgive all those who burned me, who killed my family. I forgive them for all they have done. And I hold so closely to those words that Boone Andrew always told us. Father, forgive is at the heart of our lives.
That's profound. That's absolutely profound. So I'm guessing that after this young child experienced that absolute tragedy, obviously together in the community, you were able to be together and pray together and live together and share the faith together. And it was that impact of his recovery in the safety of, your community, that he was able to go on that journey.
What's so amazing is going back to see some of these children years later in Australia. There were 7 of my children who were now at medical school in Sydney University, training to be doctors and dentists.
Wow.
And I never forget when these children just looked at me and they said, well, our daddy did this, talking about me. So we had to do it. So they had aimed for what was the hardest thing to do.
Wow. That's amazing, really. So I guess that leads me on to my next question. Would be, Andrew, of course, part of the Christian faith is forgiveness, is at the center and the heart of the message, the heart of Christ's teachings and, way of life. But I want to still ask, from an experiential point of view, how are you able to do that? Because, you've seen things that no person should ever see and should ever experience. Like we just talked about, a young child who who's so beautifully part of your community, chopped and burned. You've seen people, lose their heads. You've seen people lose their children, their families, kidnapped, fingers and toes in a prison. You've seen people attack and hurt and betray. It's traumatic. It is traumatic. So, how have you been able to be the man you are today, where you haven't been overcome by bitterness and anger? Like, has that been a supernatural forgiveness that God has allowed you to give? Has that been a hard journey? How have you
I
done? How have you walked in that?
has totally been. It's not easy at all. How do you love and forgive? I think central to all of my life has been the Arabic words al-hub, al-hub, al-hub. We love, love, and love. And that's all we could do in everything we did was to learn to love even more.
Wow. Phew. It's
And
incredible,
I want
really.
to also say that one of the key things for me was I became very ill with MS as well. And so I would say the hardest time for me was when I went into hospital once and I caught COVID big time and ended up being put in intensive care for months and months and months. And I couldn't see anybody, I couldn't talk to anybody. And it was as if all the glory of God disappeared.
Mm,
And that was like being thrown into bigger than a dungeon.
wow.
Everybody was cut off from me. And that was what was so difficult. But the thing which really inspired me and kept me going was to do with what you and I both experienced at Bethel, because I was taken to Bethel, to the Bethel School of Supernatural Ministry, and I was actually taken there after 8 of my staff were killed one day, and
Jeez.
Bethel contacted us and said, "We are going to support you. We're going to help you, and we're not going to stop." And that was where I met you, Aidan.
Yeah. Wow. Wow.
Did you become so close to me?
Pardon?
How did you become so close to me?
Well, it was from that moment, wasn't it? I remember that was a crazy experience because you were, you'd come to Bethel when I was there. I'd seen you and heard some of these stories and was just so moved. And I remember coming back to England. It was in the summer, between the second and the third year. I was, raising some money to go back, but it was in the middle of the COVID pandemic where everything was closed. So I didn't even know if I was going to be able to go back. And everything was
Right.
closed at homes, churches, and shops. And so I didn't really know what I was going to do over that summer. But all of a sudden, I still can't believe it, but this person just randomly messaged me and said that I kind of briefly knew. I didn't even know him. I spoke to him once, and he said, I'm messaging you. I know that we don't know each other, but um, Canon Andrew White is looking for someone to work with him over the summer, and I was just in shock. I was like, "What? Like, how is this person messaging me? Why has this person messaged me?" But I was like, "Okay." I didn't know if it was fake or real. And next thing you know, I was on a FaceTime call to you, and you got to know me. And I think it was
And
a few
you
days later. You
came,
said, "Jump on that train."
and it
Yeah.
was one of the best things that ever happened.
That was a profound time. It was a wonderful time. Yeah, it's incredible, really. I think it's just so moving that after experiencing so much pain, I mean, even physically, I know at the height of your ministry and life, being hit by multiple sclerosis, I mean, and then the things you've seen in your own life, to be able to be, pure in heart and have that message of love and forgiveness and have like a heart that is pure and hasn't been overcome by bitterness and frustration and anger is just, it's a testament to who you are, and also just I guess just a miracle and a beauty of the faith of Christianity, the message of Jesus, that Jesus, in his pain and suffering, was able to forgive and gives us the power to do the same.
And that's a challenge for us,
Yeah.
all in our faith. How can we make it real in our lives? And once again, how can we take risks, major risks, to do what everybody else says we should not do?
Mm. Andrew, tell me about 2014. Things got very dangerous, threats from groups, and you actually were taken out of Baghdad. You had to be privately escorted home. How was that
Yeah.
experience for you? What was it like when you found out the news? You had to leave. Like, tell me about that.
Well, basically, ISIS said that they were coming to kill me. And the Archbishop of Canterbury contacted me. And he said, I'm not telling you to leave. I'm telling you've got to leave. And so I came out, and many of my people, hundreds, had to come out and flee to Jordan. And then we set up a school in Jordan. And to this day, that school still exists, where
Wow.
hundreds former Iraqi refugees seek refuge.
Wow. And that was when, I believe, was it a layer of US protection had been lifted, so the danger had become even more extreme?
Yes, exactly. It was when the Americans kind of left. They're back now, but it was really difficult, really dangerous.
How was that goodbye when you had to leave? I'm sure people were distraught, the community you'd built there for yourself. That day you had to leave, like, how
It
was
was
that
a
day?
I still say to this day, it was the most painful experience of my life to say goodbye to those people who I love. And I remember just being in tears as I said goodbye to one of my little girls, Fuller. And Fuller actually went to America eventually. And she is now in the American Army.
Wow.
Years and years later, she is now in the American Army.
Sheesh. That must be extremely rewarding.
It is, it's amazing.
Wow. It's profound, really. It's really profound. When you look back at those moments, you look back at that time in Baghdad, you look back at those international, reconciliation meetings. What do you think was the moments that shaped your worldview the most? So these can be either the events or the moments that drastically shaped the way you thought about humanity or thought about the world or faith the most.
It was when I realized that everything had been taken from us. When you have lost absolutely everything. When you've lost your home, your family, your community, your security, and then you realize that the only thing you've got left is the love of Jesus. Nothing else.
Mm. Wow. So I'm guessing that, I mean, many people say that what you just said, at the end of the day, what you have left is the love of Jesus, but you actually really, truly got to
Experienced it.
experience that and actually see the reality of that hold up.
Because everything was physically taken.
Wow. Amazing. Andrew, walk me through, because even now, like you inspire me incredibly. If when I see the scripture or think about that kind of quote or the verse, nothing will be impossible for those who believe. I think of you, because you won't be, it will not be stopped. You will not be stopped in your work and in your impact. It's incredible. But there's going to be people listening, and they experience suffering. They are the rug has been pulled from underneath them. Maybe they've got momentum in life, finances, family, business, career, ministry, whatever that looks like, and then X, Y, and Z happens: health crisis, career loss. And I feel like if anyone is qualified to just speak into the situation, it's going to be yourself. So we'll go on a little journey here, but I'd like to start off by asking, walk me through that moment when, at the height of your life, ministry, in the I'm sure it was fast paced, multiple things going on, you found out about the MS. Walk me through that day, walk me through that moment, and
It was actually a day of agony and ecstasy. I'd been so ill, and they eventually um, did a lumbar puncture, and they got the CSF results, or cerebral spinal fluid results, which confirmed 100% I now had MS. And then that evening, my second son was
wow,
born. So that's why it was agony and ecstasy. And in a way, that's the story of my life. It has been agony, but also
wow,
ecstasy, experiencing really great things in life. And one of the greatest things in my life has actually been my relationship with Bethel, the School of Supernatural Ministry, and Bethel Church Reading. And that was how you came into the
mm,
picture.
wow. That's amazing.
And
Yeah.
I'm still involved there.
Do you feel like when you first found the news or heard the news, because there were so many things going on, did you, I'm trying to phrase this question correctly, do you feel like you had to, what's the word? I've kind of seen this in my own life when I've had physical health problems where I want to achieve something and then I found out this news, and it's like I can't accept it because I know that if I do, I'm going to have to slow down. So I kind of am naive to it and just kind of accept that it's there, but I just kind of ignore it or push it away because I know that if I actually embrace this fully, it's going to stop me from going fast, the meetings, the moments, the momentum. Did you feel that same way at the start when you kind of found out about the MS? Like you were like, okay, but I'm
Well, fortunately, I still managed to keep going, and in Iraq, they developed the stem cell treatment on me years before anyone else, and that kept me going, kept me walking for 7 years. But when later on in life, only 7, 8 years ago, I actually lost my ability to, and then I was really put down. And still nowadays, getting around is so difficult. I haven't had the vehicle, I haven't had the staff, and it's been very painful. And yet I never give up.
wow. It's amazing, really. It's so encouraging because I'm hearing you say the message. In fact, I'll let you say the message. What would your message be to someone who is maybe they've experienced something similar where they have been hit left field with some level of suffering that is warring for their, you could say, their calling, their vision, their life? From your experience, what message would you give to that person?
The only message I can give is as long as you know that Jesus has still got your hand in his hand, you can never give up.
Wow.
You must never give up. You've always got to take personal risks, to keep loving, to keep believing, and keep knowing that we have a supernatural mystery which is part of our lives. That even in the most drastic time, you can still have life, hope, and a future.
Amen. It's amazing. Actually, I'm really curious now. Do you, because you're a radical guy, like things you've done, even now, the things you still set out to do, and the impact you like to have. Do you feel like you've always had that mindset? Do you feel like you just can't stand an average life? You realize life is too short, and average just makes you sick. A boring, nice, comfortable life makes you just cringe. Or is it something else where you are so gripped by the
A-
message of God that that's inspired you? Kind of, where's this constant radical come from?
Absolutely. I am a total adrenaline junkie, but in reality, that means I believe in a totally radical
Mm,
life, God, and I will never give up on it,
yeah.
come what may.
Yeah, I love that. It's as if the consequence, even though the radical life is comes with its crazy moments and challenges, the consequences of living a comfortable life are actually worse in a way, where you have it's all comfortable and nice, but the reality of living with that is actually so makes you so sick that that's worse than the highs and the lows of a radical impactful life.
Absolutely. That
Yeah,
is
I agree.
worse.
I agree. I feel you there. I love this. This has been amazing. I guess
Yeah.
a couple of my last questions, Andrew, maybe we'll have one or two more, is you you have been very much involved with peace talks and negotiations in some of the most volatile parts of the world. We're in a time now where it's only even more volatile, especially between the Israel Palestine crisis, October 7th. Since then, what's happened in our world and the narrative and the hostility is just through the roof. Do you believe peace can be accomplished? And if so, well, what I mean by that is in a natural way through negotiations, talks, treaties. And if so, if not, why? Obviously, there's a spiritual element to the Christian faith, which many Christians believe that it will be like this until Christ returns. But if peace can be accomplished in a natural capacity, what would it take for that to happen? From your experience seeing these events and walking through them, what would it take for that to happen?
Well, people often ask me, do you think there'll be peace in Palestine between Israel and Palestine? Will there ever be a two-state solution? And I have to say, absolutely no. I do not think there will be. I think when we really begin to see peace, it will be supernatural. And it will be because of the reality of
Wow.
the coming King. And so live in hope. And all the time, I'm looking forward to that day when our Lord will return. And in the meantime, I keep working for
Mm.
it. Why? Because our Lord says, blessed are the peacemakers, for they will see peace. And so I struggle and I work towards being a peacemaker. And I don't know if we'll ever see it, but we keep
Mm.
at it and we do not give up.
Wow, that's amazing. What I'm hearing you say is that even though you believe that, when it comes to peace, a supernatural peace between this hostile, very painful, nuanced situation, it's going to be spiritual, it's going to be the return of Christ. However, even with that belief in reality, it doesn't stop you, it shouldn't stop people, organizations of getting stuck in, getting involved, being there with the broken, being there in the midst, the war, the
Yes.
pain, the suffering, the people, both sides of the aisle, being right there to clean up a mess, bring justice, forgiveness, resource. It's as if you know that that alone isn't going to fix it, but you're still not going to stop because it's part of the ride until the big picture happens. Amazing. I think that's a beautiful way to end.
That, that actually gives joy. We don't finish on sadness. We finish with hope. And hope in Arabic is a wonderful word called
Amal.
amal. And we finish amal.
It's amazing. I think that's a beautiful way to wrap up. My last question, Andrew, is what are you working on currently? And over the remainder of your work, what legacy do you hope to leave behind?
Well, at the moment, I'm working on my next book, which is called Heralds of Glory. And I'm looking at all the people who've been a massive inspiration to me in my work and ministry. And I'm looking at people like the person who was my pastor as a boy, the person who inspired me in Israel, who was Derek Prince and people like Bill Wilson and others have really enabled me to keep my eyes set on the vision in front. And you have to always be able to see where you're going. And one of the things I never do is to lose sight of where I'm going and what I'm achieving. I might not always know what that is, but I'm going for it.
That's amazing. Wow. Well, Andrew, it's been an absolute pleasure to have you on. I've told you this before, but you've had a great impact on my life and countless around the world. So it's just been a pleasure. You coming on the podcast, sharing your story, sharing your mission, your heart, some of the experiences you've had. Um, if people are listening to,
But it's been difficult for me because I've said this many times before, but you really are one of the finest people I've ever had working with me. And I thank God for that.
it's a pleasure. It's a pleasure, Andrew. Well, until next time, we'll come together and do an in-person podcast. But if anyone wants listening to this, they want to, get in touch with you, kind of connect. What's the best way for them to do that?
They can do that through Facebook if you're on Facebook. I'm very much a Facebook person. Or you can email me. My email is ambassador@canonandrewwhite.com. So ambassador@canonandrewwhite.com or
Wonderful.
Facebook.
All right, ladies and gents, those descriptions will be in the description below, that information, if you're watching on YouTube or listening on Apple. But thanks so much for tuning in another episode of the Story Vault podcast. I'd love for you to share your thoughts. It's a bit of a different episode. Share your thoughts in the comments. What were your takeaways? What did you think about as you listened to this episode? What did it inspire in you? I'd love to hear. But thank you so much. And until next time, Canon Andrew White, it's been a pleasure.